The giving of the Torah at Sinai is not only tells us about marriage, it not only instructs us in marriage and establishes that there's a great virtue to marriage, but the revelation at Sinai, the giving of the Torah itself, is in fact a marriage. So sometimes when we want to learn about Torah and understand our marriage to God, we look at human marriage, and what we learn from it we can apply to our relationship with God. And sometimes we do it reverse. You look at Torah, you look at our relationship with God, and what we learn from that, or what we're taught about that, we can then turn around and apply that to marriage in the physical. And that's because everything in the spiritual world devolves from its spiritual origin, from its godly origin. And since God is the creator of all things, and everything comes from him, it therefore follows that everything that exists in this world has its counterpart in God. And that's why there is marriage in the physical world. Not just the institution of marriage, but the experience of marriage, the ability to be married, the feelings or the state or condition of marriage that the people feel when they're in a marriage. All this exists because that's the way it is with God. God is monogamous. What does that mean? We're told in Gemara, in the Medrash, that the giving of the Torah was the marriage ceremony between God and the Jewish people. The day the Torah was given is the day we got married. As a matter of fact, we're given all sorts of details. The mountain was held over our heads like a chuppah. The 10 Commandments that God sent to the Jewish people is like the ksuba, the document, the marriage document, and the value of the stone on which the 10 Commandments were engraved was like the ring that the chassan gives the bride, the kala, and Moshe was the original shadchan, and the day was the day of our wedding. And heaven and earth were the witnesses. And what do we learn from the marriage between God and Jews? That we can apply to marriage between two human beings. A human being who contemplates or considers getting involved with God might assume that the one and only way that he can truly merge with God and be connected to God is by self-effacing. He has to stop being what he is. He has to stop being himself. He has to stop being in order to be close to God. Because where God is, nothing else can be. And so there's the belief that you have to stop eating, that fasting is a great virtue. There's the belief that you can't get married, celibacy is a virtue, and that you can't be involved in commerce and business because having physical possessions is not godly. You have to give up your ego, you have to give up your will, you have to give up your needs, you can't have any desires. You have to be totally non-human. You have to stop existing, wipe yourself out. And as long as you haven't done that, they believe, then you're not enlightened, and you're not saved, or you're not elevated, or whatever. Jews are obviously not like that. We have no need to be that way. Because when God came down to Sinai, it was a revelation unlike any other that preceded or came after it. We find, for example, that God spoke to Abraham, but we don't call it revelation. We don't say there was a revelation in Mesopotamia. We don't call the conversations that Moshe had with God before Torah, we don't call that revelation. God said to Moshe, go down to Egypt, tell Pharaoh, talk to Pharaoh. Moshe came back and he spoke to God again, and God appeared in a burning bush. But all of this we don't call revelation. And why? Because it doesn't say, concerning any of these other events, it doesn't say that God came down. He revealed himself to Abraham, but it doesn't say he came down and revealed himself. Mount Sinai was different. There it says, God came down on the mountain. Why the emphasis on the coming down? Because this was going to be a different kind of revelation. It's going to be true revelation, not communication, not delivering a message or sharing some information. God spoke to Avram and said, your children will be slaves in a foreign land. It's important information. But that's not coming down. What happened at Mount Sinai was that God not only spoke, but God made himself available. So that you want to be close to God, you can. You can be one with God without giving up your human existence. How? Because God came down. He made himself available here, which means to say that a Jew continues to be, even in his most ecstatic moment, even in the moments of highest union with God, of the greatest cleaving and oneness with God, a Jew remains obligated and responsible. You have to be concerned, you have to be responsible for the welfare of your fellow Jew, or for the world at large, for that matter, even during the highest moments of ecstasy. And it's not pulling away. It's not separating from God. You can't say that because a Jew feels responsible, therefore he's not really cleaving to God. And if he were really one with God, he wouldn't notice what's going on around him. It's not that way. There's a story from the Alter Rebbe, a famous story. He was sitting and studying in his apartment, which was on the second floor of the building, and his son, who was the Mittler Rebbe, who became the Rebbe after him, who was married at the time, he was living at the bottom floor, the ground floor, and his grandson, the Alter Rebbe's grandson, the Mittler Rebbe's son, was in a cradle in the same room with his father, and his father had this fantastic depth of concentration that when he was involved in learning or in davening, he would hear nothing, he would see nothing and feel nothing. So his father was studying a holy text and didn't hear the baby fall out of the crib. The baby was crying, and the grandfather, who was also studying, he was learning, also learning, he was upstairs, which means that his study or his concentration or his communion with God was even higher, on a higher rung, on a higher level than his son's. And yet he heard the baby cry, he came downstairs, picked up the baby, he comforted the baby, put the baby back in the cradle, and then went back upstairs. And through all of this, the Mittler Rebbe still heard and saw nothing. Later that day, the Alter Rebbe said to his son that no matter how ecstatic, and no matter how involved, or no matter how engrossed you get in the study of a godly text, no matter how close you feel to God, you can't fail to hear a child's cry. Because what's the whole point of the ecstasy and the contemplation if you don't hear a child cry? Then what good is the devotion? What good is the contemplation? It's worthless. Now, how can this be? How can you completely give up your will to God as you're expected to do? How can you completely surrender your ego to God as you're supposed to do? Completely immerse yourself in Torah, and at the same time be responsible. And what the Alter Rebbe was saying to his son was, it's good to concentrate, and it's good to be so immersed and so absorbed in what you're doing that you don't hear the bell ring, or you don't hear the telephone, or you don't hear... But the cry of a child you have to hear. Well, how can that be? It says in Tanya that when somebody is studying Torah, an interesting thing happens. Simultaneously, as the mind grasps the subject, which means that it surrounds the subject being immersed and submerged in the mind, at the same time, the mind is surrounded by and submerged in the subject. And that this kind of a double oneness, of a mutual merging, is impossible in the physical world. But marriage is not a physical thing. Marriage is a divine institution, a bonding between two godly souls. It is a reflection of the development of the relationship between God and Jews. That's what it exists for. So it's certainly not a physical thing. And on that level, we're capable of this unique and wondrous unity, as the Rebbe describes it in Tanya, the likes of which cannot exist in the physical world. It just so happens that when it comes to the physical, even within a marriage, we find that there are all sorts of laws describing the role of the man and the role of the woman. And those roles can't be reversed, because in the physical, there can't be simultaneous merging or blending. In the physical, there can only be a complementary oneness, but not a similar oneness. And so you can't have both the man and woman doing the same thing for each other, because then nothing would happen. They'd be stuck. What do we learn from the fact that God came down to Mount Sinai? What we learn from it is this. Because we're more than physical, we are capable of a relationship in which nobody gives up anything, and yet at the same time, everybody gives up everything. The way God did. God makes himself totally vulnerable in Torah and totally dependent on our goodwill. He creates a world, obviously for a reason. He trusts and hopes and depends on us to fulfill the purpose for which he created the world. So the results and the outcome of this project, of this ambition, is at our mercy. We will either do it or we won't do it. We have freedom of choice. And that's why, where it says in Torah, if you will follow my commandments and I will give you the rains on time and so on, the commentaries say that the Hebrew word shouldn't be translated to be if, but rather please, halavai. Please follow my commandments and I will give you the rain. So God is asking, is pleading with us, because he made himself vulnerable. He made himself depend on our goodwill. Of course, we're dependent on him. So at the same time that God is our creator and master of the universe, at the same time he surrenders to us. Although he's our provider, our sustainer, our helper, our salvation, our hope, everything. And yet, at the same time, as we need him so desperately, he makes himself need us. And the same is true in reverse. As much as we need him, and as much as we depend on him and surrender to him, we also make demands on him. We sometimes take God to task, not only on behalf of other people, which is always a mitzvah, to come to God and say, please, why is this person suffering? Heal him, save him, help him, so on. Even for ourselves, there are times, rare times, when we have the right and the obligation to say, I deserve better, I need, give me. Like a father has to give his child, like a master is indebted to his slave. Not to reward the slave, but the slave says, if you want me to be a slave, and I'm willing to be a slave, but feed me. You want me to carry heavy packages, so I need the strength. So give me food. And that's not asking for reward. You're not supposed to ask for rewards. We're supposed to serve God without the thought of a reward. But we do have the right, at times, to take God to task and say, you want me to work for you 12 hours a day, 24 hours a day, you've got to sustain me. Give me the strength to do what you want me to do. Give me the peace of mind to do it. Give me the inspiration to do it. So there are times when we have a right to demand of God. There are times when God is indebted to us. There are times when we have an authority that God has surrendered to us. The famous story about the sages who were debating a point in halacha, and two of them agreed against the third opinion. And so they said, well, then we go by the majority and the rule is according to us. And the third sage, a very holy man, said, no, I'm right, and I can prove it and the stream flowing past the shul will prove it. Because if I'm right, the stream will stop flowing. And all of a sudden the stream stopped flowing. But the other two sages said, no, that doesn't convince us. That doesn't prove anything. So he said, well, then let the tree standing outside the shul, let the tree prove that I'm right. If I'm right, let the tree lean over. And the tree fell over. And the two sages still said, no, that doesn't prove anything. He said, all right, if I'm right, let a heavenly voice proclaim that I'm right. So a voice came from heaven and said, Rabbi so-and-so is right. And the two still said, it doesn't mean anything. Torah is not in heaven. Torah has to be decided on earth. And God was very pleased by that. God said, my children have bested me. They've outdone me, and they're right, and I'm proud of them. Because Torah is on earth, and Torah has to be decided by human beings. And whatever they decide, that's true. That's the halacha. So in a sense, God gave us the Torah, But now we're responsible for the Torah. God doesn't come along and say, reason it out this way, think like this. The conclusion is the way we reason it out. And we, obviously, doesn't mean just any man on the street. We means the inspired, the scholar, the saint, and so on. But still, it's a human being. And in that sense, the marriage between God and Jews is not like the concept of marriage or the way that people treat marriage in other religions and cultures, where marriage means that the woman surrenders to the man, and that's the end of the story, a one-way street. The marriage between God and Jews proves and establishes right from the start that marriage should mean a dual merging, a dual blending of one into the other. The Gemara and the Medrash comment on the curse that God gave Adam and Eve, on the curses. And he shows how, as everything in Torah, it really is a blessing. The Medrash shows this, because God said to Chava, as a punishment or as a curse for her sin, she will be dependent and will long for her husband. She will be dependent on her husband and she will long for her husband. This made the women of all times, sensitive and dependent and responsive to the treatment and to the opinion of their husbands, because they need their husbands. And this was a curse, supposedly. But the Medrash says, the fact is, that from this curse, look what happened. Because a woman is so devoted to her husband, seeing how women are loyal to their husbands, every man desperately wants a wife. So actually, it's come full circle. God curses Chava by saying that she will desperately want a husband. And the result is that her husband desperately wants her. And this is not an accident. The curse turns into a blessing is not an incidental thing. That's what marriage is all about to begin with. And there's no curse there at all. There's a unique oneness, a unique blending of two human beings in that they need each other in the same way. Not one surrendering to the other, but each surrendering to each other, each enveloping the other. When you need something desperately, you are submerged in it. It surrounds you. So the man is surrounded by his wife because he needs her, and the wife is surrounded by her husband because she needs him. So they are being surrounded by each other's love, and they are surrounding each other with their love. There's another important lesson that we can get from the marriage between God and the Jews. The marriage day was the day Torah was given, meaning to say the revelation at Sinai. That's when the marriage took place. After that revelation, Jews spent 40 years in the desert studying Torah. Took a long time before the Jews understood what Torah was all about. And they had good teachers. They had excellent teachers. And they had very few distractions. There were no problems there. So for 40 years, they basically spent all their time, uninterrupted years, of studying under the greatest teachers of all time, Moshe Rabbeinu. So they must have learned a lot. And all of this that they learned during those 40 years, they didn't know, they were unaware of, at the time that the Torah was given. Which means that on the day of their wedding, they didn't have all that information. The Jews didn't know that much about God, didn't understand God. And in a manner of speaking, God didn't know all there was to know about the Jews either, because there's freedom of choice. So the Jew has, what will he choose? What all this means is that the marriage commitment between the Jews and God was not based on a thorough knowledge of each other. And the commitment of marriage is the core of the marriage. And it is a commitment made on faith. Jews were told that God was waiting for them at Mount Sinai, and they said, we will do. We need a God, let's get married. And God said, I need a people, be my people. So they were committed to each other before they knew details about each other. And that's why in bad times, when God wants to remember the good times in the marriage, God says, I remember your kindness when you followed me into the desert without food and without preparation. In other words, there was the beginnings of the relationship which was not rational. It's not that you already knew that I could make food fall from heaven and that water would come from a rock. You didn't expect such things. You never heard of such things. And yet you followed me into a desert, in a desolate place. And only later did we find out that God does these things. And it's not because we trusted him to make food fall from heaven that we followed him into the desert. We followed him into the desert because we wanted him. The marriage between a woman and a man is also necessarily based on faith. Follows this order. First, the marriage is an irrational thing because you don't really know each other. You don't know each other even as single people, living as singles, understanding each other as a single person. And you certainly don't know each other as married people. You don't know what the person is going to be like once they're married. You don't know what kind of a husband or what kind of a wife they're going to make. Nobody knows. So marriage in its first stage is totally irrational. And even though people usually have something that they see in each other, and that's their reason for marrying this particular person, but it's usually a poor reason. We like to think that we know what we're doing. So we make up a basis for our decision. But as every married person knows, when you look back 3 weeks later, you can't find what was that reason again? I don't see it. It's not there. It was useful in making the decision, and once you're married, the marriage has to be based on something else. Because what's good enough, or what works to get you into the marriage, is not good enough to keep the marriage, is not what the marriage really rests on. Like that cigarette advertisement. Come for the filter and stay for the taste, or something like that. So you've entered into the marriage by what seems to be a good idea, and then you'll find out that marriage is much more than a good idea. It's not meant to be just a good idea. And if that's all it is, then you might as well leave it. It's supposed to be something quite different. That's why it's so wrong when a person says, I'm very upset about my marriage because I think I made a mistake. I married the wrong person. What do you mean you made a mistake? Every marriage is a mistake in that sense. Yeah, but I thought, who cares what you thought? Marriage is not what you thought. Marriage is not the sum total of your wisdom. It's much greater than that. But when we treat it as if it's something I had planned and it's not working out according to my plan, you can't plan marriage. You can't rationalize marriage. You can't make it make sense. It's not meant to. It begins to make sense maybe after 40 years. But just like the Jews and God, at the end of 40 years, they finally understood the Torah, and now we're ready to settle down. But for the entire 40 years, the virtue of their relationship was not that they understood each other so well, but that the Jews went into the desert without asking and making preparations and conditions for the relationship. That's the virtue of it, that they allowed the relationship to be totally irrational. Because, again, if it were rational, then the oneness between two rational people can only be unilateral. One is going to hope that the other will follow and fulfill their need. Otherwise, there isn't going to be oneness at all. Because if you have two rational opinions and they don't happen to agree, and both of them are functioning and basing their marriage on a rational basis, then you're stuck. Then you've got a stalemate. And what happens is one of them has to admit that you're wrong, that I'm wrong. And even then, even if you do have the humility of admitting I am wrong, then it's a one-sided oneness. Marriage is supposed to be a double oneness. And that can't happen through rational reasonings. It can only happen on a higher, on a more subtle, on a more spiritual level. In other words, we don't use rational talents, we use godly talents to make a marriage. When a person says, I think I made a mistake, yes, then he has made a mistake. He's made a big mistake. But not in that he married the wrong person. He's making a big mistake in his concept of marriage. He doesn't understand what marriage is all about. When a person says, oh, I didn't never imagine it would be this way. I always thought it would be different. And it disturbs him and it depresses him. because it's not the way he pictured it. So what? So it's not the way you pictured it. So your picture wasn't right, but marriage is right. It's only your picture that was wrong. Who says marriage has to be what you pictured it to be? You had a poor image of what it is, and now you found out that it's more than what you thought it was. So when a person says, I don't understand why she wants such and such, and I don't understand why she refuses to do such and such. So what if you don't understand? This is your husband, this is your wife. What has it got to do with understanding? It's irrelevant. And if you did understand, would you then be more married? No. You'd be more logical. If you understood your wife, would you be nicer to her? Not necessarily. You would just have to find different things to argue about. Being logical, understanding the other person, doesn't make you a better person. Doesn't make you a better marriage. It doesn't mean you're going to be nicer to her. So it's a totally irrelevant thing to the core of marriage. Of course, everybody wants to be understood, and everybody wants to live with someone they can understand. But that's a detail. That's not the core of marriage. And yet so many marriages suffer and dissolve because of this inability to understand, which is really no grounds for divorce at all. The joining, the merging of two people, is a combination then of surrender and responsibility. You can't have one without the other. And where you do, you don't have a marriage. You have only a mess. I mean, picture this. Heroes in movies and so on. Some guy in the army who can do no wrong. I mean, he's perfect. And yet he's taken captive. He's captured by the enemy. And so he surrenders the way you're supposed to. And in the enemy camp, in the prisoner of war camp, he makes demands. He stands up for his rights. He maintains his dignity. And yet, he never violates the rules of the camp because he knows he's a prisoner, he knows where he is, and he behaves himself. Now this combination of, on the one hand, he has surrendered to his enemy. He says, okay, take me, I'm yours. You're in charge, you're the boss, this is your camp. It's what you want that counts. And at the same time, responsible. Because if he says to the enemy, if you're not going to be responsible, I'm going to call you on it. I'm going to stand up and say, no, that's not right. You're violating some rules. I may be yours, but when I'm yours, you have to treat me a certain way. Now, this combination of total surrender and yet profound responsibility, that's what marriage is all about. How do we know? Because that's what the marriage is between Jews and God. God says to the Jews, surrender to me totally, and then be responsible for what happens. How? How can it be? If I surrender, then I'm surrendered. Then I have no opinion. Then I have no say in the matter. Then I don't care anymore. Surrendering means not only that I allow you to do what you want, but that I no longer care what you do. I let you take over, and that's surrender. But that's not Jewish. It's total surrender and total responsibility. And they can both exist at the same time because we're not physical. In the physical, the Torah says that a husband and wife have to be together depending on the wife's demands, never on the husband's demands. It's a one-way street. Why can't it be mutual? Because in the physical, mutual is insane. It doesn't work. In the physical world, you can't have two things, two globes, two spheres surrounding each other. It can't be. One has to be big and one has to be small, and then the bigger one surrounds the smaller one, and then you have a merging. But one has to be bigger, the other has to be smaller. So in the physical, there are certain irrevocable and unchangeable conditions that you have to give into because it's physical, and physical is inflexible. But we're not physical. We're not just physical. We're also capable of marriage in the full sense of the word. And another thing. Another thing about monogamy. God chose one people, and he emphasizes it. One people out of many. A nation from among nations. What is this great virtue of having one people? Why not all people? That sounds more virtuous. King Solomon had 1,000 wives. Well, but there must have been women in the kingdom who were jealous. Why shouldn't they be the king's wife? Why should he discriminate and have only 1,000 wives? Why not marry everybody? He could afford it. It's a ridiculous question. But there's a point to it. It would not have been a virtue, even if it was possible for him to marry everybody, because it's not monogamous. There's a virtue to selectivity, particularly in marriage. So although God's measure is much bigger than our measure, to the human being, monogamy means one wife, one husband, but to God it means one people, one nation, but still one nation. And for somebody like Shlomo HaMelech, like, it meant 1,000 wives, but 1,000 wives to whom he was married monogamously. Only 1,000. Selective. This select modesty means the recognition of what is appropriate and distinguishing it from what is inappropriate. To marry everyone, to marry indiscriminately is not modest. It's not recognizing propriety. Because how can everyone be appropriate? How can everyone be right? That's indiscriminate. Modesty is probably the one act, the one issue, the one behavior that can make or break a marriage, regardless of what else is going on in a marriage. Because by its very nature, this unity, this double unity, this blending of man and woman into each other is a godly thing. It's a delicate thing. Immodesty destroys it at its root. Because marriage is a godly institution, because it engages the divine parts of husband and wife, modesty must be maintained in order to preserve this divine state. Immodesty destroys it completely. Which means there cannot be, that's a pretty big statement to make, there cannot be a marriage between a husband and wife if they are not modest with each other. But there are so many people who are married and not modest. They can be together. They may even get along, but it's not marriage. The unity, that oneness that is unique to marriage is missing. They may not have a reason to get divorced. They don't hate each other. And they enjoy each other's company, so they stay together, and they consider it a good marriage. But really, it's only a workable marriage. The specialness is not there. The uniqueness that makes marriage different from every other kind of relationship between two people is not there. Where do we see modesty in the marriage between God and the Jews? Well, first of all, God chose Mount Sinai. Why Mount Sinai? Because it was the most modest. It was the humblest. It was not the highest of mountains. And these two concepts of modesty, meaning humility, and modesty are really one and the same. And that's why we use the same word for both. In both cases, humility and modesty express the same inner awareness. The awareness of the distinguishing or discriminating between the appropriate and the inappropriate. Something can't be correct in one context. Something can be right in one context and yet wrong in another. The ability to distinguish, that's modesty. And it's humility. I may be 100% right. I may be the expert on the subject. And at the same time, I have to know when to say it, when to speak up, and when not to speak. When to claim to know, and when to mind my own business. That's humility. If two friends are walking down a wooded path, a forest path, on their way to the river, and they're carrying fishing rods, and one of them says to the other, "Have you got worms on you?" That's a very appropriate and rational question. It's an acceptable question. The person won't be insulted by it. But what about two friends walking down Fifth Avenue on their way to a black tie congressional dinner for ambassadors? And one of them says to the other, "Have you got worms on you?" Question becomes not only irrational, but insulting, in poor taste. Because you have to know where it applies and where it doesn't apply. And that's the sense of modesty. So a person can say, what is this thing with modesty? What is there to be ashamed of? After all, I was born this way. God created me this way. Why do I have to hide? It's true. There's nothing wrong with the body. And it's not ugly, but there's a context in which it is appropriate, and there are contexts in which it is not appropriate. Indiscriminate behavior, lack of discrimination, is deadly to the soul. And so it's deadly to the marriage as well. So there are these three things. First of all, marriage must not be measured by rational human intelligence. If the demand to not understand why you do what you do, is an unacceptable demand, and if the marriage is conditional, is acceptable only if you understand your spouse, then it's not a marriage at all. So that's first. Secondly, the surrenders have to be mutual and have to be accompanied with responsibility. Total surrender, total responsibility. So the person won't say, I decided that since he is so stubborn about such and such, well then, just let him have it his way, and do it his way, and I'll just go along with it, and I'll stop caring, and that's all. It's his decision. He'll be responsible for the outcome, and I'm just going to sit back and watch. That's not right. If he needs my help, then I'm going to give it to him, even though I have surrendered to him and I'm letting him do it his way. And you don't say, you want me to surrender? Fine. You want me to play it your way? Good. Play it your way. But then don't look to me for help. You're going to get yourself in trouble? Don't look to me. That's a conditional marriage. I'll surrender on the condition that you also don't expect me to be responsible. Or on the other hand, a person says, well, if I'm responsible, then you will do it my way. And don't ask me to help you. I'm the one making decisions. You want to be responsible? Then you take over. And don't ask me to surrender to you. That too is a conditional marriage. A healthy marriage has to be a combination of responsibility and surrender. Not half of each, all of each. Complete surrender and complete responsibility. Think back to our grandparents, how they behaved under these two circumstances. Picture the classical grandpa and grandma. The surrender, the devotion is total. I don't know what word to use. What did the grandfather feel for the grandmother? Whatever her whims, whatever her craziness, her mishigas, her idiosyncrasies, he was comfortable with it. The devotion, the submission, the total surrender of the grandfather to the grandmother was without conditions. Certainly in the physical, if one of the grandmothers or the grandfathers developed a physical infirmity, there was never a word of complaint, never a word of resentment. What do I need this for? What do I get myself into? Who needs this? Never. I know an elderly couple whose marriage was terrible. So it seemed. Terrible marriage. They had gone through the war. And they were still going through the war, because for them the war never ended. In more senses than one. The after effects on their nerves that had been so shattered forever that not only didn't they forget the war, but they carried it on between them. And basically, he was a monster. She described him as a monster. And that's strong language. They were in their 70s, and she decided to divorce him. Couldn't take it anymore. And with great courage, we were pretty impressed with this woman. With great self-assertion, she got herself an apartment and she moved out. Much to everybody's surprise. It wasn't an easy decision to come to. She did it and she loved it. It was wonderful. All of a sudden, we get a call from her and she's back at the house, in his house. What happened? Her husband got sick. So we said, what do you mean, your husband? You moved out. He's a monster. You want to get divorced. She didn't understand what we were saying. She says, but he's sick. He needs me. And we said, what do you mean he needs you? A lot of people need you. But that's not your problem. You moved out on him. You're finished with him. Unthinkable. Yes, he's a monster. But so what? He's my husband. The man passed away. It was fatal illness. She was sitting Shiva. And she says, he was a monster, no? Like she's trying to convince herself that it was true because it doesn't ring true. She was amazed at herself and she says, I can't remember any of that stuff, any of the bad. I remember only the good parts. The surrender is total. Under the surface of all the fighting and the criticizing and the disagreeing and the cursing and the screaming, the surrender was total. If he needs me, then never mind that I have an apartment that I'm paying for. Never mind that it took me years to work up the courage to leave. Never mind I enjoy being by myself. He needs me. End of subject. No further questions. Total devotion, total surrender, total responsibility. That's the elusive quality they keep looking for. What was it that made these marriages so fantastic? Any act, any interaction between the two that you would point to, you'll find two ingredients interwoven: total surrender and total responsibility. There was never one without the other, and so it was mutual. As much as the husband or the grandfather surrendered to the wife, the grandmother surrendered to the husband. Not less, not even different, exactly the same. As responsible as the husband felt for the wife felt for the husband. Exactly the same. Each had their own talent. One was good for one thing and one was good at another. And so they communicated on different levels. But in terms of surrender and responsibility, they were exactly the same. One could not do without the other for two reasons: because they had completely surrendered to the other, and because they were completely responsible for the other. And these two threads kept them together through everything. Then there was the third pillar on which the marriage rested, and this is modesty. They were modest. Of course, modesty comes in varying degrees. There's no question that if we got together a group of grandmothers and grandfathers from a previous generation, they wouldn't agree with each other on what is modest or what is not. They had different standards, varying standards. But what can be said with confidence is that even the most immodest among the grandfathers would be considered modest compared to our standards today. Because what to them was proper and right is to us boring, insignificant. They had a high standard of modesty, particularly grandmothers, and that modesty added the third leg or the third pillar that made Jewish marriage the envy of the world, a unique kind of marriage. So the more we learn and the better we become at relating to God, according to the way Torah describes it and trains us and teaches us, then the better equipped we are to make our marriage reflect the marriage between God and the Jews, to be a good example in human marriage of the marriage from which this evolved, the marriage between God and the Jews. And the more similarities we draw from the Shavuos marriage, from the Sinai marriage into our personal marriage, then the healthier the marriage becomes, and in reverse, our feelings towards God should be at least as good, at least as real as our feelings towards each other, if we're going to be good Jews. Questions like, why are you going to be a good Jew? Because you want to be? Because you like being good? That's not a relationship. You're going to be a good wife? Why? Why are you determined to be a good wife? Because you're in the habit of getting A's? Because you like to excel in what you do? That's not a relationship. The husband who's determined to be a good husband, he's going to be a model husband because he likes to be good at what he does. And so he's going to be a perfect husband whether you like it or not. That's not a husband. In a relationship, if you're going to be good, it means you're going to be good to the person with whom you share the relationship. And why? Why are you going to be good to her or to him? Because he or she deserves it. Not because you're special, but because they are special, because they deserve it. So if you're going to be a good Jew, why are you going to be a good Jew? Because you like being good at what you do? That isn't right. If you're going to be a good Jew, you're going to be a good Jew because God wants it. That's a relationship. A relationship is when you do for the other, not for yourself. In marriage counseling, when a husband would complain that he doesn't like he wants out of the marriage, he doesn't like his wife, and she says, why not? I do everything for you. I'm a perfect wife. So he's saying that she's no good, and she's saying, but I'm perfect. And they're both telling the truth. She is a perfect wife, but she doesn't like him. She's a perfect wife because she's well trained, because she does everything right. But she doesn't like him. She doesn't respect him. Therefore, he doesn't want to stay. She's a perfect wife not because she wants to be nice to him, not because she thinks he deserves a good wife. She's a perfect wife because she's a perfectionist, because that's the way she was told to be, and that is not a relationship. So if a Jew is trained, he's taught, this is how you be Jewish. On Hanukkah, eat latkes. On Shavuos, eat blintzes. On Pesach, eat matzahs. And he does it. He does everything. So what is he doing? Making himself a good Jew? What does that have to do with God? Where's the relationship? Being good in a relationship means to connect what you're doing to the person with whom and for whom you're doing it. And that's true of our relationship with God as well. There's one practical point which also has to be mentioned. One of the big sins, one of the biggies, like idol worship and blasphemy, is the sin of discouraging another Jew from his relationship with God. If you talk him out of it, if you dampen his enthusiasm for God, Torah says that such a person deserves the worst punishment. And you're not supposed to have compassion on this person, which means that you don't go out of your way to find extenuating circumstances, to find excuses for him, as we would do in the case of any other sin. And why is this? Because every Jew is in a relationship with God. A Jew is married to God. And to come to a wife and say derogatory things about her husband is unpardonable. And by the same token, to come to the husband and say nasty things about the wife is intolerable. We find in the Torah, in the prophets, where one of the prophets who is being humble and is excusing himself to God, he says, how can I be worthy of prophecy when I am unclean of lips and I live among a people who are unclean of lips? A reference to the Jews. And God God chastised him. And he said, how can you say that about my children? You want to call yourself unclean, that's your business. But don't you dare say that about other Jews, about my children. Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet Eliyahu, once said to God that the Jews were a disappointment because he found them lacking or wanting in the mitzvah, in their performance of the mitzvah of circumcision. And ever since then, the prophet Eliyahu has to come and be present and attend every circumcision, everywhere in the world, and for all time to come, because he accused the Jews of not keeping the mitzvah, and he has to make up for it. He has to testify now that in fact they do keep the mitzvah. And wherever the mitzvah is being kept, he has to be present in order to be able to testify to it. This applies to human marriage as well. To say something discouraging or disparaging about a husband to a wife, or about a wife to a husband, is an unpardonable sin. Because the divine beauty and greatness of a marriage is sacred, and to do anything that diminishes it, or discourages it, or dulls it, is an incredible sin. And unknowingly, we very often find ourselves doing just that. Making a husband look bad in the presence of his wife, or making a wife look bad in the presence of her husband. Not intentionally, but by our incredible charm and wit, we just seem to make everyone else pale by comparison. But we have to watch that. When you're in the presence of a minyan of Jews who are busy davening, you watch what you do. You don't shout out loud. You don't go running in and out among them because it disrupts their concentration. You don't go in there and sing a song. They're talking to their creator, to their master, to their husband. It's a sacred moment, and you don't interrupt it. You have respect for the moment. So when you're in the presence of a minyan, you're on your best behavior. To be in the presence of a marriage where there is a couple, a husband and a wife, then you're in the presence of a holy assembly, as holy as a minyan engaged in davening. And just as you wouldn't do anything to disrupt the davening or to distract people from the davening, and not even permit it to happen unintentionally, we have to be at least that careful to not distract or discourage or dampen the enthusiasm that a husband has for a wife or the wife has for the husband. It's a sacred place when you're in the presence of a marriage, and you have to treat it with sanctity. And believe it or not, the same goes for our own marriages. In our own homes, when we're with our husbands or with our wives, we are involved in a divine, sacred affair. It's a holy place, and it has to be treated with sanctity. Therefore, it's no surprise that in the davening, in the beginning of the davening, where we say that there are many wonderful mitzvahs, they're great and eternal and so on, but there are a handful of special mitzvahs whose benefits and rewards are endless, both in this world and in the world to come. And we enumerate them. One of them is bringing peace between a husband and wife, pursuing peace between a husband and wife, because it's equal to bringing peace between God and his people. In Eicha, Lamentations that's read on Tisha B'Av, part of the mourning of the destruction of the temple, where it talks about the desolation and the effects that the destruction had on the Jews. It describes the people of Israel, it describes Jews as being like a woman abandoned by her husband and therefore pursued by strangers. Because she's abandoned and she's ashamed, because she can't say where her husband is. And that's the state of Golus. When we have to apologize, when we have to convince people that we're still in a relationship with God, God hasn't abandoned us. That's the embarrassment of the abandoned woman. Now, in the end of Golus, when Mashiach comes, concerning those days, God says, "And then I will have mercy on you and gather you back, and no longer will you be called abandoned, and no longer will people be able to ask, 'Where is your husband?' or say, 'Your husband is left you, has gone away.'" There's this whole section in Torah, a whole series of laws that deals with the phenomena of the soita, the woman, a wife who is suspected of infidelity. And the procedure is as follows. If a husband has reason to suspect that his wife has been unfaithful with a certain man, he has to warn her that he disapproves of that friendship and that they should not be together again. If she's found again with this man, alone with this man, the same man that the husband disapproved of, even though you can't prove that she did anything wrong, but the suspicion has been confirmed, it's a valid suspicion, and what happens then is the woman is brought to the temple, to the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, this doesn't apply today. But she'd be brought to the Beis HaMikdash, and there she is given mayim morim, bitter waters. She has to drink this bitter water. God's name is written on a piece of parchment, and then this parchment is soaked in the water, and the water erases God's name. Now, if she drinks this, and if she was guilty, if she actually had sinned, then she will die from the water. But if she's innocent, if she in fact did not sin, then whatever is physically wrong with her is healed by the water. And if she was barren before, she will become fertile from this water. The Rebbe spoke about this once, and he explained that everything in the relationship between husband and wife, or all the laws in Torah that deal with a relationship between husband and wife, also exists in the relationship between God and Jews. While we lived in Israel, back in the good old days, in times of the prophets, times of the Beis HaMikdash, we were guilty of idol worship. And God sent a number of prophets to warn us that God doesn't like us hanging around with these idols. It was a suspicion that he had of infidelity. And the suspicion was confirmed because we kept doing it. So we were subjected to the bitter waters. Golus, exile, is the taking of bitter water. 2,000 years of exile. The Rebbe says there is no greater, no more bitter water than that. And in the end of this exile, having taken the bitter water, what do we see? What has the bitter waters proved? What has it established? It's proved that we were basically innocent. Yes, we messed around with idols, but it wasn't serious. We basically remained monogamous. We thought the idol could help for this, and we thought that it would help for that, and we thought that it would help us rise and become more aware of our spiritual. But we never left God. We never damaged the basic marriage, the basic, as the Rebbe says, we never damaged the shidduch. And you ask a Jew, how is the shidduch? The shidduch is fine. And that's been proved and established over and over again during these 2,000 years of exile. Because after 2,000 years of bitter waters, when you ask a Jew if he's Jewish, he said, of course I am. How dare you question? How dare you suspect? How dare you even suggest that I'm not Jewish and that I'm not a good Jew? And this after 2,000 years of exile. So what's been proven? What has the bitter water shown? It's shown that in this relationship between Jews and God, even when we falter in our marriage to God, even when we slip, even when we don't seem to be behaving ourselves, but the marriage is indestructible. We cannot damage our marriage to God. We don't want to, and we can't damage that marriage. It's a permanent bond. It's forever. And so, having gone through Golus, we have earned, we've deserved that God should take us back to our home and fulfill that promise that, as we said before, the quote from the prophet, that God says, I will have mercy on you and gather you back, take you back in, and no longer will you be called abandoned. And there will no longer be a question as to where is your God? Because the marriage between God and Jews will become obvious and clear to everyone that this is a permanent marriage, this is a deep marriage, this is a Jewish marriage, a divine marriage, and it will reflect in our human marriages, in our personal marriages, in the marriage between a Jewish man and a Jewish woman, that it too is a divine place. It too is a divine relationship. And treating it with that kind of a respect, based on the 3 pillars mentioned before, then we can once again have the kinds of marriages that our grandparents had, our great-grandparents had, in which they were able to raise children who could survive emotionally and mentally the most difficult and the darkest and the worst period of our history, and come out the other end and rebuild their lives and smile to each other and be friendly and be moral and be decent and be trusting and have a Jewish people go on with maybe a few scars here and there, but basically a healthy people.